Just a question before we get going. How many organizations are represented here in the defense industrial base? A couple. Okay, good. Though this presentation is targeted at you specifically, it's going to apply to everyone here. And I'll make sure that I draw those lines. But it's important also to understand not everyone runs a security firm, right? Security that is designed for another kind of organization is not good for your organization. You're not a bank. You're not a federal military installation. You have to do things that fit to your strategic objectives as a business. That's a really important thing to talk about. So, and I'm going to talk about it a little more. Monarch Information Security Consulting is a Portland, Maine-based firm. My name is John Rodgers. I'm a CISSP, and I hold every certification you can have in the CMMC universe. Have been in it since it started. That's the context. I don't want to spend a lot of time on who I am because we have a half an hour to relay a ton of information. So we're going to talk about third-party risk management, what's called supply chain risk management, the newest version of the NIST 171 for the defense industrial base folks has been put out for comment. It's going to be finalized this year. It includes a new section. There's a pretty radical set of changes in the newest version of the 171, version 3. It's available out there as a draft. You should get it and read it and become familiar with it. Supply chain risk management is now its own section in there, whereas it was not addressed at all previously. So what is it? What are we talking about? Why are we talking about it? We can talk about the Target breach. They are the one massive breach event that drove everyone to start looking at their third-party relationships. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. We'll talk specifically for the DIB guys, and then why everyone should really put this on the radar, again, in an appropriate way for your organization. So really important fact. So when you pay someone to do things for you, products, services, you are putting yourself in their hands. Their practices become a risk factor for you. Risk is an equation, a threat, and a vulnerability, and the likelihood that the threat or threat actor will take advantage of a vulnerability. That's risk. It's not a threat alone. A threat alone is not risk. It has to have a likelihood to give it a risk score. For one organization, the same vulnerability can be high risk. For another, it can be an absolute nothing. So context is everything when you're assessing risk. In this case, you don't run those companies. You hired them. Either you bought a product from them or they provide a service to you, okay? That's why we're here. This is what the NIST version 3 has to say about it. I'm not a slide reader, so you're going to get a copy of these slides and you can read the stuff. I want to provide for you the most salient information for you to take away today. Target is the reason we're here. In 2013, though if they weren't the reason, we'd still be talking about third-party risk. We just wouldn't have it be such a top-of-mind thing since 2013, 2014. And before there was a NIST 171, there was the FFIEC, the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council. And they are the guys that are boots on the ground enforcing Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and other financial regulations. And they have, since Target came out, published lots of information, guidance for our community banks and big banks in the country for how to assess third-party risk. So Target, for those of you who don't know, Target was breached because of an HVAC vendor got phished. And when that HVAC vendor got phished, I'm going to make this very short and sweet. You can read about it, or you can go do research if you're very interested. The end result is 130 million people had their credit card information stolen. Among you, probably here in the room, are in that group, right? That's a lot of credit cards. How did that happen? Because of an HVAC vendor. Well, the nature of not paying attention, Target bears most of the responsibility here. That's what it comes down to. They had published a whole page of all their vendors. The bad guys decided that was good. They went and picked a low priority vendor to target. They found one, the HVAC services, so refrigeration, heating, air conditioning. They phished one of the professionals. They got control of, command and control of that person's PC because they clicked on that link and got poisoned by remote access control software. I'm not going to get too geeky about it, but when that person or that organization, now being co-opted by the bad guys, connected to work on Target's refrigeration system, which is computerized, it's Internet of Things industrial technology, the code went right through that connection and infected Target's network. Now, Target was running a flat network infrastructure, meaning all devices, computers, servers are on the same sub-network. You know, if you're running a small company, that's probably how you're doing it too. But if you're a multinational conglomerate with huge stores and presence, that's absolutely not how you should do it. And so that infection was able to go from their refrigeration system into their POS system. And so now they had control of the entire ball of wax. Now, it's interesting to note that Target had all the latest, greatest technology. You know, the technology is not going to save you. You can't just buy things and then put them in and say it's good. That's not how it works, sadly to say. So they had all these advanced technologies shouting that there was something wrong, that there was gigabytes of data leaving, that they were in a lot of trouble, and they just weren't paying attention to those tools, okay? So here we are. In 2014, right after that, the FFIEC issued a thing called Appendix J, which is a bunch of guidance for how to treat your third parties. How should you look at them? How should you assess them? How should you get assurance that their practices won't cause you pain? That's what we're talking about here, supply chain risk. How does the other guy cause you problems? And NIST has, I mean, you've heard NIST. They are an authoritative source for so many things in the IT realm. They write special publications. They're a think tank. There are fellows sitting up thinking of ways to help people achieve goals. The cybersecurity framework that was just talked about is one of those things, but they have just hundreds of special publications that are very specifically targeted. The 830, for example, is for how to do a risk assessment. The NIST 171 is for the defense industrial base currently, but that's set to expand to every single federal agency that is executive branch and all the people that build things and do services for those agencies will be subject to this particular framework of controls. There's 110 controls in the NIST 171, and currently the defense industrial base, so contractors to the Defense, Department of Defense, are required and have been since 2017 to meet those control objectives, to be practicing those. Are they? No, they are not. It's not their fault. It was a strategic error in how things went down, that it was going to be a self-reporting sort of thing. So you're asking people whose expertise is making things to all of a sudden understand cybersecurity mumbo jumbo. Didn't go well. So a new framework and regulatory framework comes out called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And that is in the rulemaking stage right now. But we have a whole ecosystem of providers and experts and trainers and content writers already engaged and working with clients all over the place, including us. It's important to get going. Those of you in the DIB, and you probably already are, and working with someone trying to help you get there. How are you finding the experience? Anybody want to talk about it? Costly. It's a pain. Anyone else? So I just like to say, you know, when you're saying things like that in the audience context, in the rooms, in the private places, there are stronger words used. That's all I want to say. I wish I was here to talk about the whole thing because I could go on and on. I'm going to be very targeted about it. So everyone in here that runs a business relies on third parties. The DIB companies, of course, you guys have a supply chain that is hundreds of thousands of companies large. hundreds of thousands. You rely on people for a tiny part. You rely on people for a service. You hire them. You pay them. Are you assessing how they do business? That's the question. Are you looking at their practices which might impact yours? They might impact your company in a material way. In other words, defects in their material process, defects in their manufacturing process. They might impact you in a reputational way, reputation risk. They might impact you in an operational way. They might cause you to fall behind on a contract and then you lose that contract. So they have a lot of power and influence over us, third parties that we hire to do things. So some of these relationships present significant risk. Others, like your vendor for Snickers bars, not so much. Right? So again, we're not in a one-size-fits-all situation ever. And treating this particular function in your organization as a one-size-fits-all will be so painful, to use the word painful. And everyone knows what I mean when I say painful. It will cost you money. It will cost you treasure, time, people perhaps, frustration, legal battles, all kinds of things. And so how do you avoid that? You start managing a program to assess your third parties and understand who they are. And the more risk they present in the relationship, the more you need to understand. So some statistics up there on the screen. Basically what it boils down to is this one. 74% of the breaches that have been experienced are third-party derivative. So they came from a third-party relationship. You can read all about the rest of it in a minute. Third-party risk is not a one-size-fits-all, as I said. You want to create a system of assessment. What does that mean? Okay, these 4 questions right here are the key to understanding how deep you need to dive. If all of these are a no, chances are you just need to know the company has a sound financial status, that they're run well, that they do background checks on their employees. But if any one of these is a yes, and that is, does this organization actually connect to my information system? So whether it's a maintenance function or a more important function operationally, they connect to your systems. That's a yes. Deep dive is required. If they use or manage, and what I mean by manage is process, store, or transmit your confidential or proprietary information or your client customer information, then they need a deep dive understanding. If they have an operationally critical service they provide for you, you need to know more about them. And last question is, have they had a breach event in the past 3 years? If they have, you want to know more about them. Have they remediated that? Have they fixed it? That's what you want to know. So in the realm of what you want to know, these are some really broad categories of things you should know. So you're going to get a copy of the slides. Do they have a formal information security program with policies, standards, procedures that guide them to do consistent application of good practice? Do they have one? Usually all you're going to get is a table of contents if you request this document. It'll be valuable for you to see. You should ask for it. Do they train their employees? Do they secure their network with standard controls that were mentioned in the last discussion? Firewalls, antivirus software. Do they require multi-factor authentication for their VPNs and network access? Do they have an intrusion detection system? Do they have an incident response plan? So all of the things that you want to know, you have to ask. You have to request documents from those providers. If they are service providers in the cloud, they will have an audit document called a SOC 2. You can request that and read it. That is an independent audit by a CPA firm with a technology consulting practice. And it will produce a SOC 2 report, and it will be a description of their control environment and whether there were any deficiencies or things that you, as the consumer of that report, need to know because you're thinking of doing business with them. Do they practice secure software development? If you bought an off-the-shelf software or you bought a custom piece of software, what is the development methodology? Do they just fly by the seat of their pants, or are they using OWASP, which is an open standard for web developers, or another secure development technology that says to you, the consumer, they write secure code, okay? Do they test the security of their information systems? Do they have third-party penetration testing, vulnerability assessment? Do they have audit? Do they have risk assessments that are performed by third parties? Again, we're talking about people, companies that meet one of these 4 questions. You would not ask this of your Snicker bar guy, okay? But you would absolutely ask these questions if you're in a relationship that's important to you, they touch your data, they connect to your network, or they provide operational criticality, okay? Sorry, guys. You're right, that was a gross thing to say. Because if I don't get my Snickers, I just want to tell you folks. Incidentally, it's been a few hours since I've had one. Seriously, though. You do want to focus on how you're going to spend your energy, because you guys in the DIB know already. If you're trying to meet this 110, it's a heavy lift. It costs a lot of money. Anyone that comes to you and says it's not is lying to you, openly lying to you. It is a rough row to hoe. Make no mistake. It's going to cost you money. It's going to change the way you do things. You have to change your processes. You have to change the way your technology works in many cases. It's a tough, tough thing to do. So I have ultimate respect for that job. I help companies get there too. And I have empathy, endless empathy for it. Supply chain risk program components include an inventory. Number one thing, you can't assess what you don't know. How do you get a list of all your vendors? That turns out to be a really hard thing. I suggest going to accounts payable. Anyone that's getting a check, put them on a list. Figure out what they do for you. If it meets those 4, start asking those questions. Categories according to risk posed by the relationships. Tier 1 organizations. Those are the guys that might connect to your data, might manage your customer data. Tier 2, they might provide a service where they'd see something. They might provide a service that is a complementary service to something that's critical to your strategic mission. Okay? You're going to want to ask fewer questions, but still some of the same questions. A questionnaire designed for each of those categories. Again, appropriately in depth for the risk posed by the relationship. Documents, evidence to request and validate third-party security practices. That's a SOC 2, a risk assessment performed by somebody else, a penetration test, some other set of eyeballs that validate what that person or company is telling you they do. Don't just trust them, ask them for a validation. If they don't have that, ask them when they will, right? It's going to be necessary for you to sign off on a contract with them for you to have assurance. That's the way you get the needle to move. Make it a condition of doing business. Schedule of assessments is also based on those initial questions, because if you have a tier 1 vendor or supply chain provider, you're going to assess them every year. You're going to reassess them, make sure they're still in good shape, make sure they're still doing it right. And that SOC report I mentioned will be updated every year. There'll be a fresh one. And if there's a gap, there should be a bridge letter from the auditing organization that says, we didn't do an assessment for this set of months, but here's a bridge letter validating that all the controls were still in place from the previous SOC report. Okay? If you can, and it's a really important relationship, you're going to want contractual language that requires the things that you want. I require you to have a firewall. I require you to have training. I require you as a part of our contract. Okay? I want to take this time now to answer questions, and you can ask me anything you like. Sorry, I'm not sure where to point. Yes?
How far out does this go? Because your subs or vendors are going to have subs and vendors, and they're going to, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So is everybody doing this now in order for...
Are you in the DIB?
Not yet.
Okay. Thinking of it, dipping a toe? Yeah. Okay. Dip your toe. Yeah, that's a good question. Generally speaking, when you get a SOC report, if you're talking about a top vendor who's going to give you data center services or they're going to provide a critical service, and they're a cloud vendor, a cloud provider, they're going to have a SOC 2, and the SOC 2 is going to identify a couple of different things. And one is the complementary user controls you have to practice to make sure their controls work. So here are the things that you as the consumer have to do. The other thing is the subservice organizations that are providing services to that organization, if they are critical to the mission you're looking at, have to be there. Here's a company we use for this. Here's a company we use for that. Here's what they do for us. They should also describe how they vet their third parties. You're not going to be able to go much farther than that, unfortunately, unless you think this is a really critical relationship and you're not quite sure what you're hearing, and then you're going to want to go visit them and meet with them in person. But you're not going to get much farther than fourth party, unfortunately, to answer your question. Yes, sir.
So we're a company, let's say, for example, we're a company, we use a lot of third parties.
Yeah.
Let's say we have an application that has a bunch of plugins. We use it, let's say, for chat, just to keep it easy and
Okay.
those the use cases.
Sure.
Where does the line of jurisdiction go from one company to the next? If you're the host company and, let's say I'm sending out data from my application, it goes to a third party, data coming back is breached, or data going out is breached, and coming back, someone has access to our infrastructure. It's always been a gray area where the demarc point is between us and them, demarcation point. From your experience, where do you think that lies? It might be case by case, but I'm just curious what you've seen.
It would be case by case because where did the breach happen, basically? If the breach happened at, let's say Equifax. Does anyone remember the Equifax breach? Yeah? I hope you do, because all of your information is out there because of it. And I mean, Social Security numbers are not private. You guys know that, right? Those are already out there. You can go buy them on the dark web. You think I'm kidding? We'll talk after. Date of birth, driver's license number, address, phone, Social Security number, all of that is out there for 90% of credit-bearing Americans. So just so we know. When your bank asks you for your last four of your social, you should chastise them for still asking that. They should validate you in another way. Okay, sorry. Got off on a soapbox there. All right. Where the breach event occurred is going to matter, right? If the organization is breached and you are a downstream victim, then you have some legal right there. And I would, try and exercise that right. They're generally going to, depending on who they are, right? Are they a regulated industry as well? Or you said it was a chat software you were just throwing out there?
Exactly. So say it's an e-commerce platform.
Okay, now you're getting into a little bit more elevation, right? So if you're using a company for e-commerce, you should absolutely do a deep dive into who they are, how they do business. You should ask for their policies. You should ask for all the questions I put up on the board, right? But more. I mean, if you're trusting them with your transactions, then they have a bank account, right? They have your banking information. They have all your products and services. They have a lot of power in your operations. So if an e-commerce vendor is breached, then it's up to the forensics investigators and the law, depending on the amount of money that's involved, to determine who's liable. And then you have to talk to a lawyer on whether you think you've been damaged in a certain way. Obviously, you're going to be looking for third party to replace them. And I recommend for your critical vendor relationships that you have already identified alternatives and you have had conversations with those alternatives. What would it look like pivoting to you? How would we handle that? You don't want to wait for the moment when there is crisis to be cool. It's not the time when you're cool. So do these things when you are cool, right? Did I answer your question? It really is a case-by-case basis. Yeah. Sir.
What about large online portals like ShareFile, Dropbox, things like that?
Yeah.
How are you actually going to ask Dropbox for their privacy policies?
I am going to ask for their SOC 2. Yes, and they're going to have one too. ShareFile is too. Yeah. I mean, you're trusting them with a lot, right? Now, generally speaking, what we say as assessors is when we're talking about Microsoft's, the big players, they're generally thinking about everything we want them to think about, especially now. But I still want to see it, especially if there's something specific that I need. But generally, the SOC 2 is all you're going to get. right? And that is the auditor saying, we looked at their policies, we looked at their practices, and we found no deficiencies. So it's testing their controls. Anyone else, sir?
So can you talk a little bit about SOC 2 versus FedRAMP, because they seem kind of similar?
They are not. There's nothing related there, except they might look at the same things when they're in the door. FedRAMP is a certification, okay? A SOC 2, you hire the auditor, you define the scope, the auditor looks at everything you said to look at. Don't look there. Don't look there. Okay, that's part of that. Okay. It's still the most reliable thing you're going to get. But if someone has a FedRAMP moderate or high certification, that is trust, because they have already been through an assessment with a C3PAO who is trained to execute a deep audit of every control that's required in FedRAMP. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So when can we?
So you're not deciding what they look at.
When
basically.
can we decide? When you get a SOC 2 from your cloud vendor?
Yes.
And I thought that the cloud vendors had to be FedRAMP model.
So DIB, if it's DIB, yes. So your DIB, yes. If you are using cloud services, they have to have a FedRAMP certification. Yes. Great question. You other DIB guys understand what I'm talking about? FedRAMP? Okay. FedRAMP is an assessment criteria and a certification that you earn if you're a cloud services provider. So as soon as you say that you want to provide services to the federal government, right, and you want to sell to DIB companies, you have to have a FedRAMP certification. CMMC requires that you have a FedRAMP certification if you're a cloud services vendor. And if you're in the DIB and you're using a cloud services vendor without a FedRAMP certification, you will fail that control. Okay. Anyone else? Sir?
Outside of business,
Yeah.
about the typical Joe at home doing business with people.
Typical Joe, it applies. So what I would say is I do a whole ton of research whenever I'm about to start a new relationship that impacts my data, my identity, my family, our education, our banking, our healthcare, whatever it is. If I'm trusting someone with data, you bet I'm going to know how they do things. Absolutely, sir. However, it's not probably going to be a formal thing, right? But there are instances where you can just say, go up to Google and research security breaches for this company. See what you can find out. Make sure they're reputable. I will tell you right now, if you're buying things off of Instagram and Facebook, you cannot validate or verify the legitimacy of organizations selling stuff there. You may never get your product. They may get your money. So if you can't find them easily and you can't validate that they're legitimate, do not do business with them, period. It's not where we are. Anyone else? Sir?
For the, obviously being in DIB and being in the commercial and playing, both of those roles,
Sure.
Really kind of state of the art. And with AI, advancing as quickly as it is, how, what, I guess, advice do you have for being able to implement the latest technology while also being secure?
It's a great question. And I'm going to give you the answer, and it's going to be as quick as I can make it. For the most part, cyber criminals do not target organizations. They target the DoD. They target the Defense Industrial Base. But they don't look at your company and say, you're our target, unless they have already discovered a vulnerability through a scanning capability that they're doing constantly. In other words, and I'm going to translate that, if you're doing the basic hygiene, those 17 controls in level 1 CMMC, for example, are you level 1 or level 2? Okay, so you have 110 control practices that you have to meet. If you want to protect yourself from most of the bad stuff that happens in the world, just from a protection standpoint, not compliance, because if you're level 2, you have to have 110 controls in place, right? They have to be mature. I'm an assessor. I'm coming out to look. I want to know this didn't go online yesterday, right? But if you're doing basic hygiene, and this goes for everybody, personally and in your small businesses, if you're doing basic hygiene, which is you care about your passwords, you don't reuse them at multiple sites. And the reason you don't reuse them at multiple sites is because if I discover your username and password in one, I'm going to put it into an automated tool that's going to check the top 1,000 sites in the world. And And that's what I'm going to do. I don't need to be a genius. I'm not going to do it manually. I'm going to do that in an automated fashion. So if you're reusing passwords, you're done. Don't do it. Pick strong passwords. Use a good, reputable antivirus software. Have a firewall that is configured by a professional. Don't buy one at Staples and plug it in and think it's going to be the thing. It's not. Configuration matters. The basic things. Do background checks. Know who you're doing business with. Have the basic technology, and then take the interesting risk. Because, risk is not a bad word. Risk is required. You have to take it. Everyone agree? You're doing it by getting up in the morning and putting your feet on the ground. So you really have to say, I have a certain level I've achieved. This is not from a compliance standpoint, from a risk standpoint. Security is not possible, so risk is where we want to talk about. If you think you've done the things that lower your risk to an operational low level, then go do business. That's my advice. You cannot keep up with the latest, greatest. Generally speaking, though, rely on the reputable vendors to do that for you. Okay? Anyone else? Thank you, everybody. Feel free to send me a message if you want more information, more details, because this is really a full-day workshop topic. Try to do it justice in a half an hour. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.